On a Tuesday evening in early November, a man dropped $500 on the floor of a city bus and did not know it. He was 53 years old and bone-tired in the way people get when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time. His name was Calvin, and he rode the number 14 line every weekday, always the same route, always the same seat near the back window where the heater made a sound like it was trying to say something. He ran a community non-profit, a small organisation he had built from nearly nothing over 11 years, serving a neighbourhood most people only drove through on the way to somewhere else. He had been at City Hall that afternoon for the third budget meeting in 6 weeks, arguing for a grant renewal that would keep his after-school tutoring centre open through the following spring. The grant had not been renewed. He would find out the exact terms of the denial in a letter that was already in the mail, but sitting on that bus, he could feel the shape of it, the way you feel weather changing before the sky does. He had the $500 in a white envelope in his coat pocket. It was the last of the petty cash reserve he had drawn from the non-profits account that morning, intending to pay the bill for the building's furnace repair before the account froze pending the budget review. He must have reached into his pocket sometime during the hour he spent standing on the platform waiting for the bus, and the envelope slipped free without a sound, without resistance, the way things sometimes leave a person when they are too tired to hold on. It landed face down on the floor of the aisle between 2 rows of seats near a rubber floor mat that had been worn smooth in the middle by years of feet. The boy saw it before anyone else did. His name was Marcus, and he was 11 years old. He was sitting 3 rows back from where the envelope landed, in the window seat, wearing a dark green jacket that was a size too big and a backpack that sat between his knees because there was no room on the floor. He was reading a library book, which he did every afternoon on the bus home because the apartment was loud and the bus was not. He read the way some children run, with all of himself in it. He looked up and saw the white envelope on the floor, and saw the man in the aisle seat, 2 rows ahead, who was staring out the window with his jaw tight and his eyes far away. And Marcus understood, without being told, that the envelope and the man went together. He picked it up. He did not count what was inside. He did not open it at all. He stood up in the moving bus, steadied himself against the seat back, walked to where the man was sitting, and held it out. "Sir," he said, "you dropped this." Calvin turned from the window and looked at the boy and then at the envelope and did not say anything for a moment. He took the envelope and looked inside, and then looked at the boy again with an expression that was not quite what Marcus had expected. It was not grateful exactly, it was something more careful, the look of someone trying to understand something they were not sure they deserved. "Thank you," Calvin said. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, and went back to his seat and his book. If you have ever watched a child do a right thing so quietly and completely that it unsettles you, you understand what Calvin felt on that bus. He sat with the envelope in his hands for a long time after that. He thought about a lot of things. He thought about the grant that had not come through. He thought about the furnace and the letter in the mail. He thought about the 11 years he had poured into a building in a neighbourhood where children did not always have a quiet place to read. And he thought about the boy in the green jacket who had not opened the envelope, had not counted what was inside, had just picked it up and walked it over because that was what you did when someone dropped something. Think about that. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a simple, clean act of honesty from someone who had nothing to gain? Something about it changes the air. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done. The bus stopped at Halloran Street, and the boy stood and swung his backpack onto his shoulders and got off. Calvin watched him through the window, walking along the sidewalk in the oversized green jacket, not looking back, just walking the way children walk when they are headed somewhere familiar and good. Calvin rode 2 more stops and got off at his. He walked the 4 blocks to the non-profits building, which occupied the ground floor of a brick corner building that had been a hardware store, before the neighbourhood changed, and then changed again. He let himself in with his key and turned on the overhead lights in the main room, which held 12 folding tables and 47 mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf he had built himself from planks and cinder blocks. The furnace was quiet for now. The grant was gone. He stood there in the light for a while. He was not a man who sat with things easily. 11 years of running a small organisation with a small budget had made him someone who converted trouble into action as quickly as possible, because the alternative was to stare at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, which he had done enough of to know it solved nothing. But that night he did not reach for the phone or the laptop or the notebook where he kept his list of people to call. He stood in his building and looked at what he had built and let himself feel the weight of the day, the 3 meetings, and the bureaucratic language of the denial he had been handed, the way the grant coordinator had said, insufficient demonstrated outcomes without quite meeting his eye. There were 47 chairs in that room. He had counted them a long time ago at the beginning of the 3rd year when he started holding tutoring sessions on weekday afternoons and needed to know what he was working with. He knew which ones wobbled and which ones were steady and which one the children avoided because the seat was slightly lower than the others, giving you the feeling that the room was tilted. He had placed them at 12 tables himself, adjusting the spacing over several sessions until the room felt open enough that children were not crowded, but close enough that the space felt inhabited. He had hung a map of the city on the north wall and a whiteboard on the east wall and built the bookshelf himself from pine planks and cinder blocks on a Saturday in October, 3 years ago, using a level he had borrowed from the man who ran the hardware store 2 blocks over and never returned because the man said to keep it. He stood in that room and thought about the boy. He sat down at the table nearest the door and opened his notebook and wrote down what the boy had done. He did not write the boy's name because he did not know it. He wrote, "The kid on the 14 line, green jacket, library book," gave it right back without counting. He went home. He did not sleep well. Marcus lived with his grandmother, Cora, in a 3-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Eldon Avenue, 6 blocks from the school he attended and 2 blocks from the bus stop he used every afternoon. His mother had moved to another city when Marcus was 7 for reasons that were not entirely her fault and not entirely not her fault, and his grandmother did not discuss it beyond what was necessary. What was necessary, Cora had decided, was that Marcus understand he was loved and that the absence was not his doing, and she had managed both with a steadiness that was itself a kind of heroism. She worked at an insurance office processing claims, a job she had held for 14 years, not because it moved her, but because it was consistent and it paid reliably, and consistency and reliability were, in her experience, underrated qualities in both employment and people. She left the apartment at 7:45 each morning after making sure Marcus had eaten, and she was back by 5:30 in the evening in time to start dinner before Marcus came home from whatever after-school thing he had been doing, which was usually the public library 2 blocks from the bus stop, where he returned 1 book and checked out another with a regularity that the librarian there, a young woman named Priya, had started to anticipate. Priya kept a small stack of likely books behind the desk on Mondays and Thursdays, the days she knew Marcus would come in. He always looked through them carefully, and sometimes chose one from the stack, and sometimes did not, but he always thanked her. The school Marcus attended was called Briar Park Elementary, and it served the same neighbourhood Calvin's non-profit served, and it was underfunded in the way that schools in that kind of neighbourhood always are, meaning that the shortfall was not any single line item you could point to, but a general pressure that expressed itself in 2 large class sizes, and outdated textbooks, and a library that had not had a new acquisition in 4 years. Marcus's 5th grade teacher was a woman named Mrs. Oden, who kept a personal supply of notebooks and pencils in her desk drawer because her students ran out of their own before the semester was halfway done. She did this without announcement. She handed out supplies the way you might refill a glass of water, as if replenishment was simply a thing that happened in rooms she occupied. She had been teaching 5th grade at Briar Park for 22 years. She had a daughter in her 30s now and a granddaughter who was 2, and she had photos of both on her desk in frames she had bought herself at a dollar store and painted white on a summer afternoon, because the original silver frames felt impersonal. She was the kind of teacher who made small decisions carefully, because she had learned over 2 decades that the small decisions were the ones that accumulated into whether a child felt seen or overlooked. Marcus was her best reader. He was not the loudest student, or the fastest, or the most obviously charming, but he read with a comprehension and a care that Mrs. Oden noticed in the 2nd week of school and had been quietly tracking ever since. He read non-fiction especially, books about how things worked, bridges and weather systems, and the mechanics of the human eye, and he asked questions in class that were always 1 or 2 turns deeper than the conversation had gotten to yet. Mrs. Oden had the specific and particular pleasure of watching a mind arrive ahead of the material. When they read about the water cycle in science, Marcus asked why the same water that evaporated from the ocean could fall as snow in a mountain range hundreds of miles away, and whether the water in the mountain snow was ever the same water that had been in the ocean before. He asked it simply, the way he asked everything, without any performance of its cleverness, and Mrs. Oden had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Yes, actually, it could be. It was a reasonable question." He had written it down in his notebook. He did not tell her about the envelope on the bus. He did not tell anyone. He came to school the next morning with his library book and his oversized jacket and his backpack and sat in his seat, and that was all. What he did not know was that Calvin had started asking around. Calvin Merritt had worked in that neighborhood for 11 years, and he knew people the way you know people when you have spent a decade and a half showing up. He knew the building managers and the church deacons and the woman at the pharmacy counter who knew everyone's medical history and the approximate contents of their refrigerators. He knew Dolores, who ran the neighborhood association, and he knew Pastor Webb at the church on Birch, and he knew the night manager at the laundromat where half the block did their washing on Friday evenings. He knew which building had the broken elevator that had been broken for 8 months, and which corner store charged more for milk than the one 2 streets over, and which apartment the after-school children congregated in because the grandmother there made rice and kept the television on. He called the city transit office and got the route data for the number 14 bus for that Tuesday evening, which told him the stops. He knew the neighborhood well enough to guess which school a boy of that age riding that route in the afternoon would likely attend. He called Briar Park. He didn't explain everything. He said he was looking to thank a student who had done him a kindness on the bus, and could the office let him know if anyone matched the description, a 5th grade age boy in a dark green jacket who rode the number 14. The secretary said she would ask. 2 days later she called back and said she thought it might be Marcus Cole in Mrs. Oden's class. Calvin did not go to the school immediately. He went home and he thought about it for 3 days, which was his way of making decisions. He sat in the front room of the apartment he rented above a dry cleaner on Pembroke Street, and he drank the tea he made each evening and thought about the money and the grant and the boy and the library book and the green jacket. He thought about what it meant to give something back without counting it first. He had spent 11 years trying to build something in a neighborhood that the city's budget writers had never quite decided to believe in, and he understood that what he was running into, over and over, was a question of whether the people in that neighborhood were worth the investment, not a question anyone at City Hall asked aloud. They had better vocabulary than that. They talked about outcomes and documentation and demonstrated need and measurable impact. But underneath, the language was always the same old question, and the grant coordinator's answer, delivered in the language of insufficient demonstrated outcomes, was a version of no that Calvin had been told before in various forms and had always, in the end, refused to accept as final. The boy on the bus had given him a different kind of answer, and Calvin understood that the two answers were in conversation with each other. He called Mrs. Oden. He told her he wanted to come in and speak with Marcus's grandmother before he said anything to the boy. He told her he wanted to do it right. Mrs. Oden said she would arrange it, and she did, and the following Saturday morning, Calvin sat in a folding chair in a community room at Marcus's apartment building with Cora Cole across the table from him, and a cup of coffee he had not touched. The community room was a small space off the lobby with a round table and 6 chairs and a window that looked onto the courtyard. Someone had put a plant on the windowsill at some point, but the plant had not thrived, and what remained was a terracotta pot of dry soil with one stick of greenish branch coming out of the top, which made the room feel simultaneously cared for and neglected in a way that reminded Calvin of a lot of things he had seen over 11 years. There was a bulletin board on one wall with flyers for a tenant meeting that had happened 3 months ago, and a phone number for an emergency services hotline, and a notice about the laundry room hours that someone had underlined in red pen without explanation. Cora listened to the whole thing. She did not interrupt. She listened to the part about the envelope and the bus, and she listened to the part about the non-profit and the grant, and she listened to the part about what Calvin was considering. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment with the particular steadiness of a woman who has learned to assess strangers quickly and without sentiment. "And what exactly are you proposing?" she said. "A fund," Calvin said, "named for him if he wants that, or not if he doesn't, covering whatever the school says it needs, not a one-time thing, ongoing for as long as I can make it work." "You're talking about a child you met once on a bus," Cora said. "I know what I'm talking about," Calvin said. She looked at him for another moment. "He doesn't take things for free," she said. "I know," Calvin said. "I could tell." Cora was quiet for a while, The window in the community room looked out onto the courtyard where one of the other building children was drawing with chalk on the concrete in careful, deliberate shapes. A hopscotch grid, or maybe something more ambitious than that, the child working methodically, the chalk going in one direction and then another. "All right," Cora said finally, "but I want to be there when you tell him." Calvin nodded. He picked up the coffee cup and held it for a moment and then set it back down. "He's a reader," he said. It was not quite a question. "Always has been," Cora said. "Since he was 4. Taught himself the letters off the cereal boxes before I even thought to start." She paused. "He asks questions about everything. Sometimes I can answer them and sometimes I can't." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't have short answers," she said. "Why things work the way they do. Why buildings stand up. Why it rains." She looked at Calvin steadily. "He already knows more than I do about a number of things, and he's only 11. Calvin looked at the dry plant on the windowsill. He thought about the library book Marcus had been reading when he looked up and saw the envelope. He had not been able to make out the title from where he sat, but the boy had been too absorbed in it to notice the envelope fall. He had looked up from reading when the bus swayed or when some peripheral motion caught his attention, some shift in the light or the ambient sound. He had looked up and understood what he saw and acted on it without deliberation, and then gone back to the book. "I'd like to make sure he has access to as many of those books as possible," Calvin said. Cora looked at him for a long time, then she nodded, once. "All right," she said again, and this time she meant it differently. The following Monday, Calvin came to Briar Park at the end of the school day. Mrs. Oden had arranged for Marcus to stay after, and Cora came in from work early, still in her uniform from the insurance office where she processed claims, a dark blue blouse and slacks that she had worn for exactly this kind of occasion when she needed to be somewhere official without changing. Marcus sat at his desk in the classroom after the other children had filed out, and his grandmother sat in a chair pulled close, and Calvin stood near the front of the room near the bookshelf that held the classroom library. Marcus recognized him immediately. The recognition was visible in his face, a small, careful stillness, the way children look when they are deciding how much of something to show. "I remember you," Marcus said. "I know you do," Calvin said. "I came to thank you properly." "You don't need to," Marcus said. "It wasn't mine to keep." Mrs. Oden, who was standing near the door with her arms folded and her expression doing something she had to work to control, later said that those 6 words were the best piece of moral instruction she had witnessed in 22 years of teaching. "It wasn't mine to keep." Marcus said it the way you say something that is simply true, without drama and without calculation. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to tell you something. What I do." He told Marcus about the non-profit. He told him about the tutoring centre and the 11 years and the 47 mismatched chairs. He told him about the grant that had not come through and the letter and the furnace. He did not make it into a speech, he just told it straight, the way he told things when they mattered. And Marcus listened the way he listened to his books, with his full attention, his hands folded on the desk and his eyes steady on Calvin's face. "The money you gave back," Calvin said. "It kept me in that neighborhood that night. And sitting there in that building, I started thinking about what I was actually doing and why I was doing it. And I thought about you." Marcus waited. "I want to start a fund," Calvin said, "for this school. Not a big announcement, not a ceremony, just money going where it's needed for as long as I can put it there. Books, supplies, whatever Mrs. Oden and the principal say the school needs." Marcus looked at him for a long time. "Because I gave your envelope back?" "Because you didn't open it first," Calvin said. There is a moment in some conversations when the air shifts. It shifted in that classroom, in the late afternoon light coming through the windows that needed to be replaced, and over the bookshelf that needed to be refilled, and above the linoleum floor that had been swept clean by a custodian who was probably underpaid. Marcus turned and looked at his grandmother. Cora met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod. "Okay," Marcus said. He thought for another moment. "Could some of it go to the library? We don't have many new books." "All of it goes wherever you say it should go," Calvin said. "You and Mrs. Oden." Mrs. Oden made a sound that she immediately covered with a cough. Marcus thought about this for another moment. He was looking at the classroom bookshelf, or maybe past it, at something in the middle distance that belonged to his thinking. Then he looked back at Calvin. "The tutoring centre," he said. "Can I come there on Thursdays?" Calvin looked at him. "You want to come to the tutoring centre?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said. I have math after school on Thursdays and I could come after. You can come any day you want, Calvin said. Marcus nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. He did not say thank you right away. He sat for a moment with the information the same way he sat with a hard problem in class, not hurrying through it. Then he looked up at his grandmother again and then back at Calvin. Thank you, he said quietly, and then, after a pause, for coming to find me. He said it with the understanding of a child who knew that people did not always come back, and that when they did, it meant something specific. What happened next did not happen all at once. That is important to understand because the stories we tell about good things often compress them into moments. And this was not a moment. It was a process, slow and careful and sustained, the way good things often are when they are real. Calvin went back to the organization he had built and looked at it differently. The grant from the city was gone, but the grant from the city had always been something he was allowed to depend on only conditionally. And 11 years in that neighborhood had given him something the budget committee could not withdraw. He knew people. He called them. He spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table in his apartment on Pembroke Street, working through a list he had kept for years of people who owed him attention, if not exactly favors. People who had said, "Call me sometime," and meant it, and people who had said, "Call me sometime," and not meant it, and learning to tell the difference. He wrote to a man he had worked with years before who had since become a partner at a law firm downtown, and he explained what he wanted to do. He wrote to a woman he had met at a non-profit conference 4 years ago who ran a small foundation that funded youth literacy programs. She had given him her card and he had kept it in the folder labelled Future in the file cabinet in the non-profit's back room. The folder that held things he was not ready for yet, but wanted to be. He called his brother Leon, who was an accountant in another city and who Calvin could always reach on Sunday mornings, and asked him to help structure the fund correctly so that it would survive Calvin and not depend on his personal attention every time a decision needed to be made. He went to see Dolores at the neighborhood association and told her what he was doing, not to ask for money, but to ask for her blessing, which in that neighborhood was a practical thing as well as a symbolic one. Dolores had been running the association for 16 years, and she knew which community efforts had staying power and which ones faded when the original energy wore off, and her opinion about a project was the kind of signal other people in the neighborhood read. She listened to him across her desk in the association's small office above the dry cleaner and looked at him steadily and then said, "You're doing this because of a boy on a bus?" "I'm doing this because of 11 years, Calvin said. The boy on the bus helped me remember why. Dolores looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. "I'll make some calls." Over the course of about 4 months, Calvin raised enough to fund Briar Park's basic supply budget for 3 years, with a commitment from the Literacy Foundation for a library renovation that would bring in over 1,200 new books. He set it up through his organization so that the administration was clear and the money was tracked properly, which Leon handled, spending 2 weekends in the city to get the structure right, staying on Calhoun Street with a friend, and coming into the non-profit building on Saturday morning with a coffee and a legal pad, and working through the details with the patience and methodical attention that Calvin recognized from their childhood. Leon doing homework at the kitchen table, which was the same way Leon did everything. The structure they landed on gave the school's librarian direct purchase authority within the fund's parameters, which was the thing that made the Literacy Foundation comfortable enough to commit because it kept the decision-making close to the people who actually used the books. Calvin did not name the fund for Marcus. Marcus had shaken his head when Calvin offered, quietly but definitely. What they settled on was a name that pointed to the neighborhood itself, a name that Calvin had pulled from the street corner where the non-profit sat, which anyone who knew the block would recognize. Marcus seemed satisfied with that. None of this happened in the newspapers. None of it was on the evening news. Calvin had spent 11 years doing things that were not on the evening news, and he was practiced at the specific discipline of work that is its own reward because no one else is keeping the ledger. He did not mind this. He had decided a long time ago that visibility was a resource like any other, useful when it came and not worth chasing when it did not, and that the people who needed to know about a thing would know about it through the ordinary channels of a neighborhood, which were faster and more accurate than any news cycle. Marcus went on reading. He finished the book he had been reading on the bus that Tuesday in November, a book about the engineering of bridges and why certain designs could withstand lateral wind loads that others could not, and he returned it to Priya at the library and checked out another. He started coming to Calvin's tutoring centre on Thursday afternoons, as he had said he would. He came in through the front door at 4:15 each Thursday, set his backpack on the table near the bookshelf Calvin had built, and worked through his math homework in the particular way he did everything, methodically and without hurry, and then, when he was done, helped the younger boy across the table when the boy got stuck on a subtraction problem. This was not something anyone told him to do. He just did it in the same unhurried way he had picked up an envelope on a bus and walked it to a stranger. He explained the problem carefully, not doing it for the boy but walking him through the steps, and the boy's face changed when he got it, the specific small illumination that crosses a child's face when understanding arrives. And Marcus watched that happen and went back to his own work. Calvin watched this from across the room on 3 separate Thursdays before he said anything about it. Then one afternoon, he sat down at Marcus's table after the tutoring session ended and said, "You're good at that." Marcus looked up. "What?" "Explaining it. So he gets there himself." Marcus considered this. "Mrs. Oden does it that way," he said. "She doesn't tell you the answer. She asks you a question that's easier and then another one until you get to the answer." He looked at Calvin. "It works better." "It does," Calvin said. Mrs. Oden visited the tutoring centre twice that spring. She brought 3 of her other students the first time and 5 the second time. By the following fall, she had arranged with Calvin to bring her whole class on the last Thursday of each month. This became a thing the school did. Other teachers began attending as well, first Mrs. Oden's colleague from 4th grade, and then the 2nd grade teacher, who was young and had been looking for supplementary resources since September. The centre became a thing the neighbourhood counted on, in a way it had before the grant fell through, and then, gradually, in a way it had not quite been before, because the arrangement with the school brought in families who had not known the centre existed, and some of those families became regulars, and a few of the parents started coming in the evenings for the adult literacy sessions that Calvin ran on Tuesdays, which he had nearly discontinued for lack of participants the winter before. The Literacy Foundation's library renovation was completed in late winter of Marcus's 6th grade year. The school held a small event for the reopening of the library, which was not much of an event really, just a morning in the gym with juice and a sheet cake and some folding chairs, the kind of celebration that a school manages when it has a little extra goodwill but not much extra budget, which was more or less always. The librarian gave a short speech. The principal gave a shorter one. Several of the children in the school choir sang something, slightly out of tune but with considerable commitment. Mrs. Oden sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the new book display near the door to the library and did not speak. Calvin came and Cora came and took a day off from the insurance office to be there. Marcus stood near the new shelves in the library itself while the event was happening in the gym, running his hand along the spines of the new books. They were organised by subject. He found the section on engineering and infrastructure and stood there for a long time, reading the backs of books, turning them over, and reading the summaries with the focused patience he brought to everything he looked at. Calvin found him there. He had come looking for him after the principal's speech because he had noticed Marcus slip away from the gym and thought he knew where to look. He stood in the doorway of the library for a moment before Marcus noticed him. "Good?" Calvin said. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. He pulled one of the books off the shelf and turned it over and then opened it to the table of contents with the particular focused attention he brought to everything he looked at. He was 12 years old now. He was still wearing a green jacket, a different one, a better fit. He looked at the table of contents and then turned to a chapter near the middle of the book and read a paragraph, standing at the shelf with one hand braced against the wood, and his face went through a small private change the way it always did when he found something worth reading. "This one," he said, and carried it to the checkout desk. There is a thing that happens, sometimes, when a person does a right thing quietly and without reward, and the world's response to it accumulates slowly and becomes something the person never predicted. Marcus did not know on the bus that November that the man who dropped the envelope was the kind of man who would circle back. He did not know that circling back was Calvin's whole method, that 11 years in that neighbourhood had been 11 years of returning to things and people he had not finished with. He didn't know that the simple act of returning something that did not belong to him would start a chain of telephone calls and introductions and patient structural paperwork that would fill a library with 1,200 books and bring a tutoring centre back to life and give a 4th grade teacher who had been about to leave the profession one more reason to stay. He just did the thing that seemed obviously right. He picked it up and walked it over because it was not his to keep. The library opened on a grey February morning, and Marcus stood in it with his hand on a row of new spines, and Calvin stood in the doorway watching. And outside the window, the neighbourhood went about its business the way neighbourhoods do, completely and without ceremony. There are children in every neighbourhood who do the right thing before anyone is looking. They return the wallet and go back to their seat. They tell the truth when the lie would cost less. They hold a door open in the rain for someone they will never see again. Most of the time, the world does not make a story of it. Most of the time, the goodness just sits there, unwitnessed, dispersed into the air like heat, gone before anyone could point to it and say, "That one, that right there." What the boy on the bus could not have known was that the tired man in the aisle seat had spent 11 years learning to recognize exactly that kind of goodness, to track it like a contractor reading a load-bearing wall to understand what it could hold. Calvin had built his whole organization on the premise that the people in that neighborhood were worth believing in, worth funding, worth the 3 budget meetings and the letter in the mail and the furnace that needed fixing. The boy on the bus proved it one more time. He proved it the way it had always been proved, not with argument or documentation or demonstrated outcomes, but with a simple, complete act in a moving vehicle on a November evening, as unremarkable and as permanent as any other true thing. Cora watched her grandson in the library from across the room. He had found something in the engineering section and was already reading, standing at the shelf with one hand braced against the wood, completely absorbed, completely still in the way he got when the material was good. She watched him for a long moment, and then she looked away and pressed the back of one hand briefly to her mouth. And then she composed herself and went to get a piece of the sheet cake before it was gone. She stood at the table in the gym with a paper plate and a plastic fork and watched the other families around her, the other children, and thought about the years it had taken to get her grandson to this moment, and the specific texture of each one of those years, the money she had managed carefully and the questions she had answered as well as she could, and the reading she had listened to from the chair in the living room while he sat on the floor and read aloud to her in the evenings, not because she asked him to, but because he liked to hear how words sounded when they were spoken. She thought about all of that, and she thought about a white envelope on the floor of a bus and an 11-year-old boy who did not open it. She ate the sheet cake. It was good. That evening, after the event, Calvin walked back to the non-profit building alone. The light was still grey outside, and the streets were damp from the morning's rain, and the furnace was running, a sound in the walls that had been repaired properly now, a steady, reliable sound that was a different kind of quiet than the quiet it had been before. He unlocked the front door and turned on the lights and stood in the main room for a moment, looking at the 12 tables and the 47 chairs and the bookshelf he had built himself. He was thinking about the 4th grade teacher he had met that morning, the one who had almost left. She had come up to him after the event and told him what the tutoring centre had meant to her this year, and he had listened and thanked her, and she had shaken his hand with both of hers, which was the kind of handshake that meant something specific. He was thinking about Leon, who had come down for the event and gone back that afternoon, and who had said as he left, "This is what you built, you know. This is actually what you built." What? Calvin had not known what to say to that, so he had not said anything, which Leon understood. He sat at the table nearest the door, the same table where he had sat that November night, and he opened his notebook. He crossed out the line he had written months before, the one that said the kid on the 14 line. Green jacket, library book, gave it right back without counting. He wrote next to it, 3 words and a comma. Marcus Cole. Briar Park. Engineer probably. He closed the notebook. Outside, the number 14 bus went past without stopping, its lights reflecting off the wet street in long amber lines, the familiar route going where it always went, carrying whoever was on it through the neighbourhood at the end of the day. He sat there for a while longer in the quiet, and then he turned off the light and locked the door and went home. If this story stayed with you, leave us a word in the comments. Tell us what you would have done with that envelope. And if you have more time tonight, stay close, because our next story is about a woman who showed up for someone when there was nothing in it for her, and what she found waiting when she finally looked up. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the real acts of quiet honesty and good faith that take place in neighbourhoods like this one every single day.